Good morning, everybody. This is George Wheeler with International Crisis Room 360. I am here today with the team from APAC Assistance, and we are going to get started here in just a moment. While we're getting ready, because we have a global audience, we want to give everybody just a couple minutes to get in. Not very much. We do want to get started pretty much on time here at 10 o'clock. So if you could, just in the chat, go ahead and let me know that you can hear me, and just put down where you're from. So we can kind of see what areas of the world are being represented today. And it's always good to know everybody can hear me. And while I'm waiting for that, Paul, can you hear me, sir?
Yeah, I've got you loud and clear.
Very good. Okay. Thanks, Patrick. Good morning. And while we're also getting everybody logged in here, good to know that everybody can hear us loud and clear also. While we're getting everybody logged in, Paul, I would like for the APAC Assistance team to go ahead and introduce themselves today.
Okay, well, firstly, I'm Paul Quaglia, Managing Director of APAC Assistance. Originally Australian, operations roles in the Army. Spent a lot of time in Indonesia and now based in Singapore. Over to you, Bhargav.
Hello, everyone. This is Bhargav Reddy here, joining you from Bangalore, India. I work as Operations Manager at APAC Assistance. Raga or Anshika?
Hi, everyone. My name is Anshika. I'm based out of New Delhi, India. I have a background in law and politics, and I work as the Information Manager at APAC Assistance.
Hi, everyone. I'm Raga. I'm based out of Bangalore, India. I'm working in APAC as an assistant manager, and my background is in international relations.
Back to you, George.
Okay, thank you very much for your introductions. And everybody, thank you very much for letting us know where you're from. We do have a global audience, and you know, a lot of this is because there's a lot of interest in the Asia Pacific region. And I've known Paul for several years now. His team does an amazing job in Asia Pacific at collecting information and helping organizations to understand their operations and the risk throughout Asia Pacific. So this is going to be a really good update for Asia Pacific here today. And please get some notes ready. If you have questions, go ahead and put questions in the chat, and then you can mark it as a question so that I know that you're actually asking a question as opposed to maybe just something that might be in the chat. So we do have a presentation for you today, and Paul is going to go through the presentation with his team, and after that we're actually going to pull up the International Crisis Room platform to the hotspots and go through some of the hotspots throughout Asia Pacific also that maybe we don't mention here, or we may even get some what's what I'm looking for. It's, you know, we're expanding on some of the things that we already talked about. So Paul, thank you very much for you and your team being here and providing this for us. We really appreciate you guys setting this up, and take it away, sir.
Okay, thanks very much, George. And if any interesting questions come forward, feel free to push them onto us at any time. Could we just jump a slide forward there? So obviously there's some highly visible tensions going on at the moment at the geopolitical level between China and America in particular, especially with the added tensions from comments coming out of Taiwan. Bhargav, I might actually just get you to round off on some of those issues.
Thank you, Paul. So China and the US have been at each other's throat for a long time now, especially in terms of trade, but not limited to trade, as the US has dominated in terms of world leadership. They have also dominated in terms of soft power. Soft power in the sense they have been a norm giver, as in when I refer to norm, I mean democracy. So China has challenged that position of the US at multiple levels. Firstly, they have set up parallel institutions such as Asian Infrastructure Development Bank, as well as their One Road, One Belt initiative, which tries to tackle the American leadership at various levels, starting from debt given to some of the smaller countries which have looked up to the US time and again. At the same time, the US and the Chinese trade to add context to the whole scenario, the trade is valued about 140 billion US dollars, and US has a trade deficit of all the way up to $340 billion. So given such a wide gap in the trade deficit, it is bound to have a direct impact on the domestic politics, and thus the US candidates such as Trump raising it at the domestic level, making it a campaign issue, and ratcheting up the international rivalry with China across Asia Pacific as well as other regions in the world. Right. So in the recent times, especially with the deceleration of on the economic front, both in the US and in China, there's a whole new dimension to it. The recent reports suggest that the unemployment in the US have gone up all the way up to 40 million people registering themselves as jobless. Now, this will actually aid Trump to target China at the domestic front, despite their recent agreement with China in January, which actually promised China that they're going to buy nearly 200 billion more of their goods, right? So the conflict is multifaceted, and it is going to have a different dimension in the post-COVID scenario, especially now that both China and the US have accused each other about being behind the spread and not being transparent about the outbreak as a whole, right? So, Paul, do you have any questions here?
No, I don't. I think, George, do you have any questions for us? You want us to dig a little bit deeper on that geopolitical?
No, I don't have any questions for that right now. One of the things I would like to ask, because we have quite a few people in the U.S. and our media, they're, I don't want to say posting incorrect information. I don't want to accuse them of that, but it may not be the most reliable information. Is some of the things that we're seeing in the U.S. about PPE gear in China, how accurate are some of the numbers that you guys are getting out of China?
Look, I'll jump in there, Bhargav, if you don't mind. Look, I think there's certainly some media embellishment going on at the United States end. Obviously, it's election year, and some of the media coming out of the States is a bit distorted. Certainly, when we're looking at the various medias, obviously China's not a little bit distorted. It can be significantly distorted. But the sources we use and the media arms certainly seem to be more balanced out of countries. Singapore, in particular, tends to sit in the middle ground. And occasionally, some of the news services out of Australia that are objective do present a different view. So I think that's something to be cognizant of. The severity of these PPE issues, in my view, aren't as significant as the media are making them out. And I hope I haven't upset any of my American friends there.
No, and I'm not. Well, I don't want to upset anybody either. What I want to make sure of is there's obviously a lot of American organizations whose supply chains run through China, and we don't want to get caught off guard at some point with supply chains interruptions. So one nice thing is to know that if you're getting good information out of China, that maybe organizations who have supply chain lanes running through there that need better information than what they can get from our media itself, maybe they can reach out to your organization and help them with that more accurate information.
Yeah, most certainly they can get a hold of us through you, and I think it's important that the supply chain issues are real. There are challenges there. I'm not for a minute saying it's all smooth and honky-dory, but China's not the only place experiencing problems with supply chain, albeit it's a significant market and it's a significant supplier. Japan's announced that it's allocated a couple of $2 billion for companies to relocate some production from China into Southeast Asia to try and mitigate their dependency on certain supplies of materials and part-produced products. So the supply chain issues are real and maybe beyond the scope of this evening.
And you kind of answered a question that just came in from Tony Legg also about companies moving from China to India, or outside of China, moving out of China. Do you guys see that as a trend as tensions continue, or even after we move out of the recovery phase or into the recovery phase for COVID-19?
Look, I think some of the China reactions have been over the top. That China had a good opportunity here to just keep quiet and not get into a dispute. President Trump certainly got a response that's going to help him domestically. Certainly countries like Australia have been advocating for an objective third-party opinion, and that's affected. They've been cut off from an 80% tariff whacked on barley, and talk maybe even affecting iron ore exports. I think today Apple's talking strongly about relocating some of their facilities from China to India. So this is and sadly China could have played a smarter game of chess here. They just needed to allow an objective independent investigation, which would have happened anyway by the WHO. So they were fairly hair trigger sensitive. So this is going to affect the global balance as it pertains to Asia Pacific. There's no doubt about that. This is extremely interesting time for our analysts and for businesses operating in Asia Pacific, George.
Yeah.
Okay, Paul, if I may, I would like to explore a little further into the issue of multinationals operating in China and originating from the US, or those who are catering to the US market. Okay, taking from the unemployment issue, now there are clear signs of deflationary indicators setting into the US market, US being the biggest market. It also is going to reflect on the aggregate demand, right? So when the aggregate demand kind of dries up due to lack of income and unemployment, it is likely to have a detrimental effect on the bilateral trade as well. As the demand dries down, retailers like JCPenney and Macy's are likely to feel that pinch, thus canceling orders. Like very recently, we saw canceled orders, which were addressed to Bangladesh, and we can actually see similar scenario going towards China as well. So in such a scenario, they may actually see certain challenges coming up in terms of holding up the deal which happened in January this year, or the China-US trade deal.
Okay, thank you for that. Another question came in from Charlie. We talk about China-US tensions, but there's also tensions between China and Australia. Could you please expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, look, certainly the tensions are growing. It's nothing new for the China-American, I beg your pardon, the China-Australian relationship. The Aussies we're better known for rugby union than for political skills, and that extends to Parliament. Some of the intent that Scott Morrison, the Prime Minister, had was sound, and perhaps indeed the nominated speaking point for some of the traditional allies. It's something that we will negotiate periodically from time to time, just because of the different stance we take in terms of values, openness, transparency. This is going to be potentially a significant one. As mentioned, it's not stopping with barley. It was also beef exports are getting tapped. Discussions about iron ore. If it starts to move down the path of coal and iron ore, it's significant. I was talking to a friend in Canberra today, and he was talking. There's a lot of significant planning going on behind closed doors in Canberra to look at alternative markets. And one thing I think to note is the farmers in Australia are really bashed. They've had a massive drought. A lot of the peripheral areas have had fires. Now they've had COVID-19, and to top it all off, the government's jumped in and created a tit for tat with, a superpower or an emerging superpower. So this is a real issue. The ongoing verbal skirmish is something that's real, has to be monitored closely. If you've got business that's vulnerable to that, really need to take note. And if you want to drill in more, I think you said it was Charlie that asked the question, feel free to contact us anytime, because it's certainly thick on our radar and starting to fill our database up fairly rapidly.
Okay, very good. Thank you so much for that. And that's probably it for China. We can move on to the next one.
Yeah, so obviously Southeast Asia or the wider ASEAN's taken on a lot of challenge from the COVID-19 situation, and we might just cover off on some of that and maybe touch a little bit on North Asia too. But Raga, I might whack you on the spot on this one, if you wouldn't mind.
Sure, Paul. So when we look at Southeast Asia and the response to COVID-19, it's largely been varied. We see huge disparities in the number of confirmed cases, and there are enormous differences in the case of fatality as well, from say 1% in Singapore and in Brunei, but to over 9% in Indonesia. Now, when we look at the response in Southeast Asia, it is actually quite different from the West. A handful of governments have been very proactive in Southeast Asia. They've done contact tracing, they've imposed strict quarantines at the expense of their economies. Whereas there have been governments like North Korea, which have been in complete denial, which have downplayed the crisis because they are afraid of the negative economic repercussions. It obviously, when you look at the crisis as a whole, we notice that a successful response almost has nothing to do with the regime type, because we see democracies, Taiwan, South Korea, and New Zealand have had fantastic responses, while others like Philippines and Indonesia, which are also democracies, have floundered. Likewise, some autocracies arguably have done a good job, whereas others have been at the forefront of virus denial. While this is an economically painful decision in the short run, the governments that were decisive implemented public health screening as well as contact tracing measures. They were able to fare well. They were willing to shut down both international and domestic travel, and they completely closed down non-essential businesses as well. We saw this most clearly in Vietnam and Singapore during the first wave of the pandemic, wherein they really worked hard to ensure that all of the measures were in place to make sure that they fight the virus head on. One of the features is that leaders who made decisions based on medical and scientific evidence, differing on their public health and medical officials, they have managed to come on top. So conclusively, we can say that effective responding to any pandemic requires a whole of the government approach. Governments that have had a holistic strategy to deal with the food supply, public health, and they've created a broad-based stimulus package and mitigate the economic slowdown, they were able to win the public trust and compliance. So this really requires coordination on the national and the state level. Also, the governments that have communicated with the public in a transparent manner, they've tended to quickly win the confidence of the public. The Philippines and the Indonesian governments may have come to power via elections, but their incompetent handling of the pandemic has actually weakened their legitimacy. If you see in Indonesia, Jokowi has actually won actually won a spectacular mandate. However, due to his response to the pandemic, there is increasing criticism against his government. So in conclusion, basically Southeast Asia's response has been widely varied, and some countries have really managed to tackle the virus, and it has come under control considerably. Some countries have almost lifted lockdown measures. China, for example, they have managed to, for most part, they've lifted down the lockdown measures. So it's just a combination of the right approach by making sure that all of the information is in place, as well as the appropriate measures to be taken. At this point, are there any questions?
I might just add a point there, Raga, that this isn't something that's peculiar to Southeast Asia, obviously. If we look at, we're not covering South Asia today, that's for another night, but Pakistan in South Asia, Brazil in the Americas, governance is governance no matter where it is. But I think mitigating, particularly for Indonesia, is that poverty's a real concern, and it has a history of massive civil unrest and sudden onset unrest events. So that in defence of Jokowi, he isn't dealing with a really advanced, highly capable government, and add to the supply chain 17,000 plus islands of an archipelago. So he is really juggling a time bomb there. So some of it that we perceive to be incompetency, it is through our goggles, but he's really juggling some larger concerns there in a country with such a history of violence. So, George, anything from you?
Well, there is one question. Monish wants to know, how do you assess Singapore's approach to COVID? I think that's an interesting one, because they, right after SARS, they'd done some pandemic planning.
Yep, sure. I'll have first crack at that if you don't mind, team. Look, I think they've done very well. They've had, on the back of SARS and MERS and various local epidemics, they've been very well prepared. And right now, you could argue that the relaxation which they announced yesterday for coming out of what they call circuit breaker, which is a lockdown, is probably way too conservative. Singapore's secret has been one, like a lot of Asia, but particularly Singapore, it's got a very obedient and compliant community and really good communication at the community levels. Whereas, the contrast to that is in so-called modern Australia. Hey guys, we're going to lock down. So they go down to the beach in groups of 5,000 and hang out having a picnic. So it's taken a lot of those really advanced or perceived to be advanced countries a while to get that this is serious. From the moment this looked like being talked about, unlike the States, certainly unlike Brazil, they were very quick to start border controls, and most importantly, contact tracing. And they have very good apps ready to go for contact tracing. Here we are 3 or 4 months later, and the UK is talking about having an advanced, world-beating contact tracing app. Well, Singapore's had one for a couple of years and implemented it almost immediately. There's a perception from outside of Singapore that there's a lot of cases and it's out of control, but I have to state Singapore has a massive workforce from countries that aren't known for being on top of these things and having a high level of testing, namely a massive workforce from Pakistan, India, Nepal, Myanmar, Indonesia, Philippines. So they were actually very quick to isolate workers and work out which workers and which work areas, dormitories, construction sites, factories had a problem, and move them into some very large expo halls and dormitories where they were able to isolate the cases away from the Singaporean residents, the Singaporean citizens, the permanent residents, and basically have done exceptionally well. That the problem Singapore now has is it's got a low aversion to risk. So it's basically now in a position where it's getting, 1 to 5, but closer to the 1 new cases a day. Forget the deaths. I'm sure one of our staff, I think it's 22 deaths, but it's very low figure, and it can only be so long that you hold back a society economically, but also from no social interactions. So if anything, Singapore's done too well, and they're in a bit of a balancing act. When are they going to let a little bit of freedom back? Okay, I hope that answered the question.
Yeah, I think it does. And in a country like Singapore, I mean, social interaction, it's the whole country. Tourism is a huge part of everything they do, so they want to get back on track as soon as possible, as does many other places in Asia, because they depend so much on their tourism. In the US, we're moving into phase 2 in some places of our recovery, and I don't even know that some of the states that are moving into phase 2 have peaked yet. So do you think that in Asia you'll start to see two things? One, starting to lift some of the sanctions because of social pressure, and lifting sanctions before they even know if they've peaked on the COVID-19 cases?
No, I think the Asian societies and Australia, New Zealand, they're very cognizant. There's been, the SARS, the MERS, avian swine. It's very cognizant of it. I think actually that inability to manage the emergency and then go, okay, now let's re-stimulate the opening up of social interactions and, more importantly, commerce and education. I think they're going to be largely led by societies that don't have the luxuries of countries like Singapore and indeed my country, Australia, where they've got the ability to make a decision, close it down, perhaps not with really well-considered sequencing, so there might be a delay, but they ultimately throw some money at the situation and try and keep businesses afloat, keep employees. Whereas countries like Italy and Spain, they don't have that luxury. They've got large financial issues they're dealing with, a lot of pressure from other European Union states. So they're announcing now, and Italy's far from out of this, particularly in the south. It's hasn't experienced its peaks yet, but they're opening up tourism. So's Greece. So I think that's probably going to assist Singapore and Australian government to stop strangling the turkey and realise at some point we have to find a way out of this. Australia and Singapore and indeed New Zealand are probably being a little bit too conservative now. And if one criticism I have of my own government, that on paper has handled this very well, some of the planning's been very one-dimensional. They haven't thought of the consequences of the decisions they make until a couple of weeks later, and then they have to fix it up. And, like right now, Australia and New Zealand fundamentally have so fewer cases, and they're going to debate for 3 months whether they should start, international flights and facilitate trade with more flights and allowing air cargo. So I think it's going to be led by countries that have had no choice. And I think that some of the assumptions they're making that herd immunity won't develop and you may be able to get reinfected. I think these are very, very worst case conservative assumptions, and countries like Spain and Italy and Greece are going, hey, look, you know what, we've got to get on with it. Otherwise we're going to have a nation that becomes, rapidly becomes banana republics. So I don't think it's going to be led by smart decision-making or prudent decision-making, because governments are paranoid of hurting their reputation, but they're probably not seeing the long-term impacts on the economies. So as unfortunate that is, I think it's going to be led by the nations that have to get on with it.
Okay. Hang on one second. For the questions from Armani and Elena, we're actually going to talk about Myanmar and Malaysia specifically in a minute, so I do want to hold off on those for a second. But just in staying with the COVID-19, with the possibility of some social unrest if people stay in lockdown any longer and the economy is not being opened up, are there any steps that corporations should start preparing for civil unrest, or is it looking like if these governments open up their economies, it'll reduce even the options for civil unrest?
Yeah, look, we're working with members and also with clients on a consulting basis where unrest has potential. Now, that's not only in Southeast Asia, but South Asia as well. And it really depends on the footprint, George. It depends on their exposure, and it depends on which particular countries they're operating in, but also their footprint within that country. For example, clients in Jakarta would be very prudent to have wise planning. Obviously, international evacuations aren't possible, but identifying safe havens and having really disciplined stay from home processes in place, make sure the local supply can be supplying family foods and medicines without potentially getting infected. But countries like that are perceived that there could be civil unrest, Philippines, for example, you have to look at the governance above it and the powerful nature of the deterrent of often militant governments, whereas countries, you know, that have less state control, you know, Indonesia would be a good example. There's a reason they're actually letting people move from outside the lockdowns. Initially, they called it an emergency degree situation. Then they've changed the terminology to loosen it up. But right across Asia Pacific, in the best of times, there's a chance of civil unrest, whether it's fed by politics or disgruntled labour unions, or, you know, when something happens like this and you've got people that are not that far off the poverty line being unemployed, you've got limited medical capacity, and governments that their capacity is being stretched to the limit. You know, certainly you need to identify what pockets could affect your footprint and drill in on those, and have plans to ensure that you, one, can predict and identify the indicators that are showing, hey, this is getting a little bit out of control, but have a plan ready to go to you know, do a relocation nationally within the country or the state or the island, but also have some safe haven, you know, quality international hotels with good security, for instance, in place. So, George, is that adequate, or do you want me to dig in a little bit deeper for you?
No, that's good. We'll, because we've covered COVID-19 quite a bit in other webinars, and it's going to be ongoing. We'll be talking about this in the next couple of webinars anyways. But let's go ahead and again, Elena and Ramani, we're going to address your questions in just a minute, because I'm going to lump those into the countries when we talk about them. So let's go ahead and move on from COVID-19.
Yep, sure. So next, I guess we're going to cover Hong Kong, and today there's been yet another issue come out of China. In fact, we just issued an alert a moment ago where China, Beijing's basically deliberating on the national security legislation for Hong Kong. And we might discuss that in a little bit more detail. But Bhargav, I might get you to just sort of wrap up on Hong Kong. Again, it's been covered quite a bit, so not too much time.
Yes, so Hong Kong has been a boiling pot for over a year now, and it all started with an extradition law, and recently, just this month, the tensions went up again with a controversial law which would criminalize any disrespect to national anthem of China. And just today, a new report suggests that they are trying to write in a national security law, which would essentially criminalize, or which would deem any activities which are anti-China as treason or sedition or even secession, for that matter. Now, this effectively voids the special administrative region in practice, and thus having a direct impact on Hong Kong's relationship with the US and all the privileges it enjoys with the US under a special treaty, the US Hong Kong Act, I guess. So to that effect, the tensions are likely to rise if this actually becomes a law, or if there are any developments towards that. And Carrie Lam, in fact, has deemed it an essential constitutional requirement, which makes it even more controversial. We will know more once the official press conference, which is scheduled later today, comes out with a proper statement from the Chinese government.
So something to add to that. Protests are really imminent right now, regardless of if this law is passed. Even if it's brought up for deliberation, there are going to be protests. And when I say protests, I don't mean smaller protests. In 2003, when the same legislation was brought up, there were about 500,000 people on the streets right after that. So in case this legislation is brought up for deliberation, we can expect a large number of people out on the streets protesting against it. And something to be mindful of are the legislative elections that are coming up in September. If these tensions persist, then civil unrest may be used as a reason to delay the elections as well. So that's something to look out for.
Yes, further to that, the protests since last year did really have an impact on multinationals based out of Hong Kong. In fact, some of the banks, in fact, had to close up operations in some of the locations due to rising protests and protests turning violent. So if the protests do turn violent this time around as well, it is definitely going to have an impact on multinationals and their relationship with their subsidiaries across the region, in fact.
So Hong Kong has one of the largest ports in the world. How is this impacting the ports and people's ability to get trade in and out of Hong Kong?
So Hong Kong right now enjoys some trade privileges. Last year, when the whole extradition issue was going on and the protests were going on, the US actually threatened to lift that special status, wherein it basically enjoys imports and exports with bare minimum tariffs. Now, if that happens, then exports and import will definitely be impacted, considering the ongoing tensions between China and the US. Hong Kong has to maintain sufficient amount of autonomy as per the US in order to maintain those trade privileges. So in case this law gets through and the US doesn't think that Hong Kong is sufficiently democratic or sufficiently autonomous, they may actually go ahead and draw back the treaty. If Paul, you have anything to add?
Yeah, I might just add there, George, too, that on the longer term, the situation in Hong Kong could lead to a fairly drastic, and many people think this is already occurring, that the Greater Bay Area, which is a massive series of cities and seaports, could become an alternative Hong Kong. So the Chinese government could play a long game and just offer incentives for Western companies to set up a new base. So that's something for anyone with significant supply chain through or in and out of China and Hong Kong to consider. The supply chains, though, currently are holding up surprisingly well. Now, we're all reading about, where it's not working, but it's surprising how resilient the supply chains have been, particularly on critical foodstuffs and and indeed on medicines, and despite some high-profile incidents, PPE, and of course the political issues surrounding confiscations and breaking of supply chains on PPE, something that we all need to continue to monitor. But even more important to PPE, believe it or not, is that little thing called food.
Yeah. So, any questions on Hong Kong? Anybody? Where could new shipping base be created by China?
Well, look, it's not going to happen on the short term, although they could ramp it up. But the whole Greater Bay Area is, currently being looked at, and that area, is the equivalent of Tokyo, San Francisco, and London in terms of sea cargo. So it's already a large established area. It would just be a case of, making it a political centre and making a point to Hong Kong that, whether regardless of how they think philosophically, it's a lot easier for Hong Kong citizens to protest than it is for China to accept there's going to be another Taiwan on their doorstep. It's just, from a viewpoint as a future superpower, they're not going to allow such a fragmentation. So, all the port cities, predominantly north and northwest of Hong Kong, very as a grouped port, there is significant capability right now.
Okay, thank you for that. Is it safe to say we'll be talking about instability in Hong Kong for quite some time?
I think so, yes. And I think that it's not going to go where perhaps all of us from a Western country would like it to go. I think we can safely say, it's not going to go where our values would think it would go.
Okay. I think we can move on from Hong Kong.
Yep, sure. So look, obviously Indonesia is a very complex country, comprising, as I mentioned earlier, more than 17,000 islands. It's spread over 4,000 kilometres east to west, and it's very large country. It also represents about 30% of the ASEAN economy. So in its own right, it's a serious player. It's a G20 nation. I don't want to cover off on COVID-19 because I think we're all COVID-19'd out. So I decided to just raise a couple of things that people may not be aware of that are significant for any players with business in Asia Pacific. You've got two major things happening. One's the Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, which has already passed both the Australian and the Indonesian parliaments. So it will come into force on the 5th of July, and it's a very strong, bilateral agreement. Now, what a lot of people don't realise is obviously they realise there's some political and cultural differences in Indonesia, and you don't get much larger cultural difference than an outback Aussie cattleman and a well-to-do Indonesian middle-class or upper-class person from Yogyakarta or Jakarta. But surprisingly, there's the lowest amount of trade for two countries with a contiguous border. So it's actually been brought in to overcome a lot of the challenges both in red tape and tariffs, and it's cut through a lot of that. It's taken many, many years to get in place. And frankly, it gives Australian companies and Australian citizens operating in Indonesia, if it's played by the law, and that's another issue, it gives Aussie companies servicing the oil and gas industry, for example, exporting foods into and various products that are not easily available in Indonesia. It gives them a massive competitive advantage. So, if I had a company and was doing stuff in Indonesia, I'd probably be thinking very seriously about finding an Aussie partner because it's that powerful. And largely it's gone undetected. It comes into power on the 5th of July. It goes both ways. Obviously, Australia's got a lot of agricultural products that Indonesia just simply can't produce to the same quality or the same amounts, particularly because of the different climates. But this covers an array of things: electronic services, consulting services to the oil, gas, mining sector, complex consulting services to transport, logistics. If you haven't read up on it, contact us, get a briefing on it, because this is a major thing to flag inside your businesses. Similarly, the omnibus bill is something that's quite significant as well. So basically, President Widodo initiated an omnibus bill, and to give you the degree of how big a bill it is, it's 1,028 pages, it's 73 laws, it's 15 chapters, 174 articles. So this is trying to overcome a lot of the red tape that affects foreign direct investment into Indonesia. Now, I won't go into the complexities on the oil and gas side of things or the mining because we'd be here all night, but this is an attempt to break down some of the real barriers for businesses that are investing to Indonesia. Things like archaic laws, very maternal belief that the employer owes an employee a job for life, conditions and pay that are just not commensurate with the rest of ASEAN, yet alone, Africa and South America. So the omnibus bills, obviously been delayed from COVID-19, but it's a really, really significant thing to look into. And Anshika, you might like to drill in a little bit more than that overview.
Yes, Paul, I would definitely like to do that. Omnibus bill, actually, there are two of them. One is on job creation and the other one is on taxation. And it tries to make, as Paul rightly said, a number of changes, around 74 articles in total. And last year, in fact, there were multiple protests by labor groups that, in fact, turned violent even in Jakarta. So this is something definitely to look out for. Now, while laborers are so upset about this, is because Indonesia right now has some of the best rules for laborers. Their laws are very advantageous to laborers, which sort of dissuades businesses from carrying out their work in the country. However, this new bill, if it's passed, it would allow them to procure license easily. It will make severance issues easier, termination, and even severance pay for that matter. So to give you an example, right now, in order to terminate any employee in Indonesia, they need to get an approval from the industrial court, which is a long drawn process because of the litigation costs and everything. This law would actually allow them to terminate employees without getting that permit. And it also sets a cap on severance. So it will resolve a bunch of issues for Indonesia to conduct business smoothly. But on the other hand, the omnibus bill, because it's being so heavily opposed by labor groups, once the COVID situation subsides a little bit, there may be protests once it's brought up for deliberation in the parliament again. So that's something to look out for. Paul, any questions from me at this end?
Look, I think that's good. I think just to note there that the one lurking crocodile in Indonesia at the moment is the issue of severance pay. As many companies have been hit very, very hard by the impacts of their business of COVID-19, technically many companies could be insolvent and not capable of paying some of these extremely generous severance payouts that are wedged into law. So the delay of the omnibus bill prevents certain changes that could well bite the Jokowi government quite severely. So I think add that to your watch list. Thanks, George.
Sure. And Antonio's asking about the business and financial risk assessments if you want to do business in Indonesia. And I wanted to add to that really quick and just say that one of the things that Indonesia has historically been known for is corruption. Is under Widodo, has that been moving in a positive direction?
I could write a thesis on that, so let me try and just keep it short. But any countries wanting to do business in Indonesia, first thing I would say, if you're in a business that by law requires a government partner, then unless I've been looking at the wrong Indonesia for the last 24 years of my life, not getting involved in corruption's nigh impossible. In fact, the only one I could think that could probably put their hand on their heart at the pearly gates and say they've given it a brilliant shot would be BP. I think everybody else is a case to answer if they were investigated accordingly. But if you can keep away from needing government partners, Indonesia's a growing middle class, 270 million people. It's wonderful to do business there. But let's not just look at the Jokowi era. Let's go right back to Suharto. Since a strong man of Suharto fell over and took his 80-odd kids with him, corruption's gone from everybody knowing they had to give the Suharto family 10% to every government official across the archipelago thinking they are Suharto. So it's a very agile and way beyond Jokowi to deal with it now. There's been a very ominous progression and that the powers of the Anti-Corruption Commission have been pegged back and that there are some very sinister personnel, and I won't mention names on this open forum, but obviously some of the particular old guard, which ironically is called the New Order, which were the group that took power from Sukarno and placed Suharto. Some of the New Order are still in power and they're in ministries, they're in critical portfolios, and they're trying to hang on to power. And sadly, they're not hanging on to power to help society, they're hanging on to power to keep a chance of access to wealth. So Indonesia is something that if you're going to do business there, frankly, doing due diligence is along the line of a Western business process isn't going to expose and reveal the obstacles, but understanding your partner. Indeed, selection of partner is the critical thing. Selection of local partner is bigger than appointing your chartered accountants. It's bigger than looking at your taxation and your costs and the costs of your rent and the costs of your labour. You get the wrong partner, or if you don't know the Indonesian minefield, then you need to do significant research. We hope I answered the question. It's a very complex matter and look deeply into that.
No, that's a great answer. I think we can go on from Indonesia.
Yep, sure. Just to round off on Myanmar's obviously very interesting at the moment, and I just wanted to raise Myanmar because it often gets left off briefs on ASEAN and Southeast Asia, and people forget that it's an economic opportunity lurking out there. Obviously, it's got several states that are in a armed conflict with the central government, but that aside, you've got 50 to 60 odd million people. You've got a government that's finding its feet. You do have elections coming up later in the year, but what you do have with Myanmar is a government that several years ago we went in there frequently to look at when we were going to establish our business entity in Myanmar, and we made the decision as recently as December to fully incorporate and man up there. The reason I say we delayed that decision so long was because the government took a long time to realise that if you don't have laws and you don't have regulations and you don't have an ability even to do simple things like incorporate, then people don't come in and invest. Well, in the latter half of last year, they really started to get rid of some bureaucracy, open up the online incorporations, simplify a lot of the processes, and they've really made it quite easy to go in and do business. Now, the perception from the West is still sort of that there's a militant Myanmar military government, everybody's getting little puppets and their strings are getting pulled. Okay, I'm not saying that doesn't exist, but it's grossly exaggerated and it's largely out of place. There is a bit of a power skiff going on between the old military and the current government. But the current government now has all the power, and they are making some fairly rapid changes. Now, we see this because we're also operating a cash in transit business in Myanmar, and the security and the cash in transit regulatory environment doesn't exist. But they actually then said, well, look, in the absence of having nothing, your permit of business will enable you to do business in the interim while we get to regulations. That said, the banking and the insurance sectors are the first to be getting opened up and getting unregulated. There's some massive infrastructure projects going on, particularly from Japan, and building if you like, a satellite city next to Yangon, and building a massive, a new bridge across the river. So there's a lot happening in Myanmar, and I think the British government announced today that they're giving $30 million to the Myanmar government to help them fight COVID-19. But for those of you with business responsibilities or advising your business leaders, they need to keep Myanmar on their radar, because Indonesia's corruption's a big limitation. Vietnamese central control can be a big limitation. The regular changes of government in Thailand can be an issue. But the sheer size of Myanmar and the resources it's sitting on with oils, with mining resources, it really is something to keep an eye on. And Sheikha, I'm not sure if you want to add some on the political side.
I think politically, more or less, there are just elections coming up in November. That's something to look out for. And the situation in the rest of states like Shan, Chin, and Rakhine, the situation more or less remains the same. So no prominent political change till the end of this year, and no change in the scenario in terms of fighting as well. COVID-19 has clearly not dissuaded either the Myanmar military or the rebel groups from retaliatory attacks. So that's expected to continue.
Yeah, and I think the particularly the 4 states that are in war and very similar to the south of Thailand, many companies aren't aware that if they've got countrywide logistics and supply chains, that there's some real significant high level conflicts going on to be aware of. So just, you know, at least flag southern Thailand and the border states predominantly. George, over to you.
So, and it helps Myanmar, you know, obviously they're not landlocked like Laos. They have plenty of ports. What will this do for the currency, do you think, opening up?
Well, it's been surprisingly stable. There's still a distrust of the local currency by the Myanmarese people, but there are some very large players, both local banks and international digital companies, getting involved in investing in Thailand. Yoma Bank domestically, Kasikorn Banks put a large investment in there, but Myanmar has probably the greatest thing that will stabilise it is as the country gets some degree of control. It's estimated in my last chat with the International Finance Corporation head in Myanmar basically said that they think somewhere between 80 to 90% of what should be in GDP is going into Bangladesh, India, Thailand, but predominantly into China, because those warring states, you can pretty much read, they're sitting on top of wealth, either subterranean oil or gas, or gems and rubies and jade. And they have the largest and highest quality of jades, gems, and high value rubies. And you're talking, you know, a little stone as big as a little eraser on the end of your HB pencil, and it can fetch $40,000, $50,000. The quality's so high. So there's two things they can do to keep their currency stable. One is to start developing processes to get that wealth to come back in through the national coffers, and hence they're trying to clear bureaucracy and overcome conflicts with dialogue. But the second thing they can do is add value. So there is some very skilled, for example, cutters and polishers of various gems and jades, but by bringing in equipment and ramping up the skills, they can add a lot of value. Meanwhile, Bangkok's trying to become the global value add for gems and rubies. And for those of you that have been to the Sialom area of Bangkok, you can't help but see that both the wholesale and retail centres. But Myanmar can do a lot to stabilise its currency. It really is in such a state of infancy. The only road for Myanmar is up, and we're not currently assessing Myanmar elections as being anything that would significantly impact that ultimate slow but steady rise for Myanmar, not just on the currency value, but on all major economic indicators.
And Elena had asked about the COVID-19 response in relation to the ethnic minorities. A couple of years ago, they had the about 700,000 from Rohingya that moved into Bangladesh. But now we also have the skirmishes in is it Rakhine? I'm not sure how you say that.
Rakhine, yeah.
How is this going to impact also them being able to open up, and how has their, if that wasn't already addressed, I'm sorry, with the response to the minority ethnic groups?
Yeah, look. Sadly, the issues in particularly in Rakhine and Karen states are historically deep, and there is a very large discrimination between the ethnic Myanmarese in Yangon and in the Delta and in the south against the particular states on the western and the eastern borders and mountainous areas. So those discriminations, combined with the ethnic groups feeling not only discriminated, but the government wants their wealth, but also having access to trade elsewhere across the borders to the west, to the east and to the north, means that fundamentally Myanmar is going to continue to be divided between the states that have their own armies and the central government. And to a large degree, that's not going to change. There's no wise levels of mediation There's no open books. There's just too many discriminations and too much distrust historically. That said, you can do a lot of business, and Myanmar can do a lot of business with the world and never have to go to any of those states, because pretty much most happens up the central corridor, which is Yangon at the central south, heading north to the new capital, Naypyidaw, and then up to the old capital of Mandalay. So there's a massive nation in its own right when you ignore those borderless conflict states, George.
Okay. Ken is asking, drugs being an issue. Actually, Ken, we're going to address this in just a minute. I guess we can do it now. There was a massive bust. Most people don't realize this, but Myanmar is also the second largest opiate producing country in the world behind Afghanistan. And recently there was probably the largest drug bust in Asian history. It was massive. Obviously, drugs can be a problem throughout Myanmar. How is that impacting people moving into the country also?
Look, the Golden Triangle, so right up there, in that Thai Myanmar border area, you got to perceive it to believe it. You got to see it. The mountains are, in the north of Myanmar, everyone's thinking tropical. It has thick snow. It's very, very high mountains. It's very low valleys, and so their ability to grow opiates in particular is enormous. And then, of course, the Thai government has some wonderful pockets, some wonderful capabilities, but Thailand's not immune from corruption, particularly amongst certain elements of the non-military security apparatus. So fundamentally, the drug issues there are not going away anytime soon. The previous king of Thailand worked a lot on it, but very strategically, placed dams, educated people to do other crops. But in Myanmar, they're 50, 60 years behind that progress. Because of the warring states too, it means that the access up into those remote areas is very difficult. So the international NGO community finds it very hard to get in there geographically. We have clients and that us and our partners deal with. It's very, very serious armed executive protection, and it isn't a case of making a VIP feel good about himself. This is for NGOs trying to move into the areas they're doing business. So the drug problem, it's enormous, Ken. It's not going away anywhere quick. The combination of warring states that prevent movement, the whole military issue there, the whole open nature of the mountains, the porous borders, particularly into Thailand and China, but also ultimately into Laos and Bangladesh and India. It just gives such an opportunity for illegal crime syndicates to operate that it's not an easy fix. It's here to stay. And in fact, the hoist that George referred to, is an indicator that it's a very, very big issue. It won't affect people though moving into the Mandalays, the Yangons, and Naypyidaws. They're a world away from that. But the drug issues, it's extremely large, and you got DEA, and you've got anti-crime elements of the State Department and international NGOs working on it, but really they're driving around mainly in nice four-wheel drives in Yangon. So, Ken, I'm not optimistic on that.
Yeah, but for that, I'll just like to add one small point here. But specifically for Myanmar, the only region to monitor would be Shan State, because that sort of shares its border with Thailand and Laos. That's where most of this drug trafficking happens. So that's something to keep an eye out for. It doesn't necessarily impact the whole of the country. It's that particular region, and Paul has already mentioned limitations to do with the region.
And the mountains in that area are phenomenal. They're spectacular, not only in the north of Myanmar, but the eastern side of Myanmar, so the western side of Thailand. It's a very thin peninsula there. So when you're on the Thai side, so just inland from the city of Hua Hin, which is a famous beach and golfing resort, you can literally ride a push bike from Hua Hin to the Myanmar border in a day. Now, the border mountainous region, the Thais have air patrols, foot patrols. They have roadblocks on the roads heading north, south, and east, west. But as a former infantryman, it's just a dream area to remain undetected there. The mountains and the valleys are incredible. There's many passes if you're on foot. There's all kinds of stuff happening in there, use of drones, use of elephants. It's very complex, but the geography means that it's I hate to say it, but drug syndicates would love the topography.
Okay. I'm going to share my screen here, and you should be able to see my screen right now. This is the dashboard on the ICR360 platform. I want to go through some of the hotspots in Asia Pacific here, and kind of point out a few of them. And now some of these, if I point one out and it's a little old, just go ahead and let me know that that some of these situations have passed. But one of them I wanted to hit, of course, was we had a hotspot for the drug bust in Myanmar, so that was going to be a good one, and kind of an important one too. Your explanation was amazing, and actually the explanation on Myanmar, a country that most people don't really understand. If you want to do business there, I highly recommend reaching out to Paul prior to going into it, and just don't go in and invest. Get some information because you're going to need it. One of the countries I want to talk about is the Philippines, though, because when you look at the Philippines, hotspots galore. They've got a plethora of activity. They got earthquakes, they got volcanoes, they got typhoons that just hit. They have the coronavirus, they got pandemic, they got terrorist attacks with the Abu Sayyaf, they got communist rebels, they got people being taken hostage and kidnapping. Just doing business in the Philippines with everything that's going on in there. Guys, could you kind of give us an update on the Philippines a little bit?
Yeah, look, I think you covered it pretty well. It's a bit of a basket case, always has been, and unfortunately always will be. If maybe you could expand that hotspot map, just click it to take it out a little bit broader, if that's possible. But look, the Philippines, we call it the training ground for security professionals. As you pointed out, it's got regular typhoons, communist insurgencies, very advanced Islamic terrorism, most of which is actually commercial syndicates and landowners wanting to gain advantage from their territories. It's misunderstood. It's complex. It's an archipelago of several thousand islands, which surprises people. But you've had multiple killings in Maguindanao, which is a part of the island of Davao. You've had 55 people murdered leading up to an election because one clan wanted to muscle in on a clan that was already agreed to be the clan that was going to be re-elected. You've had major Western brand hotels and casinos, hostages taken, the hotels taken over by gunmen. Pretty much, if you want to study everything that you can about international politics, just keep probably going and hover over the hotspots in the Philippines, because you're going to see it all. And it's a high risk place. So typically cities like Cotabato are perceived as nice, innocuous hotel areas, but then when you look at the wider Maguindanao, they're an extremely dangerous place. So,
or even Mindanao, for that matter.
So I was just adding that it's the south of Philippines.
where most of these insurgent groups and
Yes, from the Islamic perspective, but there are other movements, not only but mainly. There's still an active communism there. There's a lot of piracy in the Philippines, so companies looking to operate offshore need to really check their entire travel security profile, right from landing in either Manila, Cebu, or Davao, and heading offshore. Road movement, particularly through Davao, can be disastrous. At night, there's bandits. Pretty much there's large chunks of that entire island where the hand is sitting on Davao. That island has massive areas where you just can't go at night, regardless of who you are. You can't just cuff executive protection there. There's also a very active ex-police force, and I'm sorry if I upset any viewers, but for the good of the majority of listeners, Philippines police do not have a professional reputation, so they'll pretend they've got tapped into the intelligence world. They'll pretend they're highly capable executive protection. They're not. The military in the Philippines, like Thailand, like Indonesia, are far superior, both technically and training and discipline. So, Philippines is a very, very complex risk environment in summary, George.
Absolutely. I actually want to move over here to India because there was a hotspot that I saw for a nationwide trucker strike. If we already have some problems with our supply chains, this would not lend any help. Anything we can add on a trucker strike? Is this current?
Look, I might hand that over to one of our team in India. Who'd like to grab that one, Bhargav or Anshika or Rugga?
Oh, my fault. Actually, it looks like that might have been that one might be a little old. They may have seized. That may not even be an issue anymore, which is a good thing.
Yes, so India has mostly had a migrant workers crisis because so many of them have lost jobs. They've been laid off, and they've wanted to go home because the governments within the city haven't been able to sort of provide enough stimulus packages or deal with those crises. So there have been some clashes with migrant workers and the police in a lot of places. In fact, even in metropolitan cities like Delhi or Ahmedabad, for that matter, they're big cities, they're port cities. And now there is a cyclone that's called Amphan, which has impact, which is going to have an even worse impact on places like West Bengal and Orissa. Again, West Bengal is a very important port city in India. So the crisis seems to be only getting worse for the country, especially considering the cyclone coinciding with the COVID-19 crisis. Raga, if you would like to elaborate.
Okay, and let's talk about like health and safety in India. You had the chemical gas leak in the plant that killed 11. Thousands of people suffered breathing difficulties. This had to stir up memories from the Dow Jones Chemical plant catastrophe that they had in India. What is India doing to ensure that these companies that operate in India reduce the risk to this happening?
So George, like they rightly say, they say about the Bhopal gas tragedy that you mentioned, the gas tragedy was a tragedy and the handling of the case was a bigger tragedy because there was not adequate compensation, companies were not made to feel as reliable, and this gas leak recently definitely brought back some memories. However, the scale of the gas leak wasn't as big because this killed 11 people and it was a South Korean company and not a US-based company. The government has been relatively quiet about it ever since, and there hasn't been many protests also from the local people ever since, even though that was foreseeable. Raga, could you probably elaborate on that a little bit?
Okay, thank you.
Sure, Anshika.
Go ahead. Now this one's a little bit old, but I do want to address this. A lot of people do business. If you do business in Thailand, you do business in Bangkok. But we had a discussion kind of before we got started about South Thailand, and organizations sometimes when they're moving into Thailand, I see they're starting to branch out from Bangkok. But Paul, what are some of the risks of getting into South Thailand?
Well, look, there's a very advanced level of militant groups. So the history is very interesting. The southern part of Thailand used to be the northern part of Malaysia, and when the Brits were still the colonial power in charge of Malaysia, literally the cocktail party, they said to the king, we just can't work out the issues there in our north and how to deal with them. The Thai king offered to move the border south and take care of it, and 70 odd years later they've still got a massive conflict going on there. So there's 4 provinces in the south. The 3 main ones are Yala, Naritawat and Patani. There's a 4th Songkhla, but it's calmed down a lot. But in the last 2 decades, there would have been 15 to 20,000 deaths. There's been, several thousand incidents where basically they're bilingual speaking Thai. So they speak Thai and Malay. They're Islamic. They agree. They're not part of Malay, they're not part of Thailand, they're part of the Sultanate of Patani. So they see themselves as a mini kingdom. Now, that area is a very healthy area in agriculture, fisheries, but it's also a big channel for the pipeline, the Asia Pacific, I beg your pardon, the Southeast Asia, ASEAN pipelines go running right through all of those provinces I just mentioned. I had the privilege of driving and flying along the entire pipeline and checking out all the facilities down there. But it's a very strategic location. There's also a lot of illegal migrants coming in, particularly from Myanmar, from the west. There's a lot of illegal controlling of migrants for profit, illegal movements of oil and other commodities. So it's very much controlling the ground. But the militants there are very advanced. We're talking they hit 17 banks in the space of 3 hours to make a point on their capability. Another time they did 25 fatal incidents in a 24-hour period. They're very advanced tactically. They counter ambush the emergency response crews. And again, it's extremely mountainous area. This map doesn't depict it, but the mountains are high. So, and there's massive rubber plantations, coconut plantations. So it's a guerrilla warfare dream vegetation down there. So it's very significant. Now, of course, there's issues in Bangkok too. There's occasional bombings, the use of M79 combat grenade launchers. There's real issues at the political level between the pro-royals and the pro-change, if you like. So there's a significant chance for Bangkok to destabilise. I mean, there's a reason the military government there, which the West describes as a coup, which I prefer to call a necessary military intervention, which is obviously Thailand, even in Bangkok's far from out of the woods from a security paradigm, but in the south, be aware it's an extreme war zone there.
Very good. Thank you very much for that update on South Thailand. In Cambodia, we had 600 workers from a garment factory start protesting because they weren't getting their salaries. There has to be some underlying issues here besides, if they're not getting their salaries, is it COVID-19 is the organization who can't pay the salaries? Is this a big slowdown for the garment factories, and will we see more of protests?
This is happening right across Asia Pacific at the moment. Sorry, go ahead, Anshiga.
Yeah, Paul, I was just going to say that. I think the issue is not just limited to Cambodia. Even if you look at a country like Bangladesh, which is not very far away, there have been protests literally every day by ready-made garment worker factories, and the same applies for multiple other countries. Paul, you can go on.
Yeah, so the governments are ordering people to pay severance pay, treat their employees well, but the companies are in hardship themselves. They weren't counting on having no revenues. They weren't counting on paying severance pay. So this is an issue, and frankly, it's surprised there hasn't been more high-level conflict. So, the factories on the north of Myanmar, throughout India, throughout Indonesia, big pockets of Thailand. You know, this is an issue affecting the entire Asia Pacific region. I guess other regions as well, though I'm not privy to that. But that kind of thing is twofold. One, it's some unscrupulous bosses electing not to pay, but on the main, they can't afford to pay. They don't have margins in their business that enable allocations to be sitting there to make ongoing payments. If they're not producing, you know, they just can't sustain their business, let alone these sudden severance pays or maintaining employee wages. It's easy for government to say, hey, you've got to be honourable, and laying people off's the last option. It's not if you're the employer and you don't have any business. It's an immediate cost-saving measure that most companies operating in a low margin environment are forced to take.
Yeah, I would actually say there would be an increase in such movements across Asia Pacific, especially those countries which are dependent on, let's say, A-list brands like Zara or Macy's or JCPenney, which of recent, if you see the reports, they are going belly up, primarily because they are not getting any demand as the income has dried down. So once there is no demand, they have to cancel orders, which will directly have an impact on the production processes, like closure of factories or temporary halt in production, which also has domestic effects as well. Like increase in labor issues means a greater turbulence within the domestic politics. So I would expect an increase in such issues, especially in countries like Bangladesh, Cambodia. India is slightly different because Indian domestic market is big enough to absorb majority of the demand, but not so in other countries like Cambodia and Bangladesh.
And Myanmar.
Okay, George, back to you there. There's a good question that's just come in if you want to tackle that. There's a question there from Charlie, George. How do countries tackle natural disaster in the wake of global pandemic? This is a fascinating question. We're seeing it with the Typhoon Amphan at the moment, where all the shelter areas that are normally used for such natural disasters, particularly in areas in Bangladesh and Myanmar, where there's millions of people living in, if you like, coastal deltas, so that normally they've got various community facilities lined up to use. So it's a real issue at the moment because they're all full. In fact, the statistic yesterday for the northeastern coastline of India, in Orissa, where the typhoon's hitting, 680,000 people were evacuated. Now, as an Aussie, that's just phenomenal to think that a government could move that many people. But of course, the complexities of moving people in that environment and trying to keep social distancing, it's just simply not possible. So Charlie, I think a short answer is with great difficulty.
Adding to that, we need to also underline and note that the federal structure as well, because the state government of Odisha and West Bengal have shown amazing level of maturity in tackling cyclones after cyclones. Especially Odisha has a legacy of maintaining such efficiency. The last major cyclone similarly was Cyclone Phelan, and they had double-digit casualties, maybe 30 odd. So such preparedness has actually contributed to a matured handling of an extreme natural disaster.
Okay, George, how are you going there?
Paul, I think Tony also has a point. He says that it would be good to cover more on Myanmar, as more companies are looking at it as a low-cost country on the next webinar, if possible.
South Asia is probably a more bigger and wider audience. I think we should do one specific for Myanmar, because a lot of companies, but many don't have a footprint there. So yeah, Tony, point well taken. George? Not hearing you, George. We've lost you, mate.
Sorry, guys.
So look,
I was talking away, and then all of a sudden you said you couldn't hear me no more. Melanie had a question on the stability of Malaysia. We missed it when we were on Malaysia, but how is this instability in the government affecting foreign investment?
Not sure. And Shika, you or Raghu, would you have a view on that?
I think, Paul, the situation is evolving right now, so it's hard to say how it would impact foreign investment right now. But definitely, any form of political uncertainty does cause some doubt in any investor's mind. But in Malaysia's case, it's been ongoing for a while. They have experienced political instability in the past as well. I am not very sure how that's impacted the investment environment in the past, but this is not new. Raghu?
Okay.
Yeah. So basically, with the current crisis that's evolving in Malaysia, foreign investors are rightly apprehensive about investing, but also we have to consider that the COVID-19 pandemic is ongoing. So naturally, foreign investors throughout the world are reconsidering because they are more and more risk averse, and we have to see how the developments go as far as Malaysia is concerned to actually get a full picture.
Okay. And the last question that we had just moved on from Hong Kong, you kind of addressed this already, but how do we keep it from becoming another Taiwan? You mentioned that if this outcome may not go the way we would all think or hope that it would go, but is this another Taiwan?
In short, I think that, as I mentioned before, that whole Greater Bay Area, you're talking Guangdong and 9 other cities. It's called the Pearl River Delta. People should research it. It's going to become a very critical geopolitical strategic point. China's not going to allow another Taiwan, and it's a lot easier to control Hong Kong from and I hate to say it, but from a military control perspective, it's a lot easier to get people into Hong Kong than it is to Taiwan. But they won't take a military option. They'll take that strategic option. So they'll focus on the Bay Area around Guangdong, and they'll just start offering incentives and slowly depower the Hong Kong society. And unfortunately, Hong Kong citizens are they're a victim of history. They believe in many ways that they're British. The reality is it was leased for 99 years. It's now back with China. So when you've got, what is it, 1.4 billion people, you can't let, less than 10 million become problematic, and they're not going to allow another Taiwan. So look, strategically get to understand Guangdong and the Pearl River Delta and the 9 cities that have access to that Greater Bay Area, because it's ultimately going to be China's, how they're going to move their chessboards to avoid another Taiwan occurring. They'll just depower Hong Kong slowly. Okay.
Very good, Paul. That's all the questions that we have in. That's all the questions I have. Is there anything that you and your team would like to kind of summarize with or to follow up?
Oh, no, look, I feel free to reach out to us at any time. George has our contact details, only too happy to engage with you. And of course, in the next week or two, we'll be only too glad to do a session on South Asia, which is bigger and even more complex again. So thank you, George, from myself and our team.
I thank you very much, everybody, for joining us today. We appreciate you all for the update. Thank you for your questions and your interaction. Paul, we look forward to you and your team being on for another Asia update next coming weeks. Thank you very much, sir.
Cheerio. Thanks
Thank you,
all.
team.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, George.
Thank you, Josh. Thanks, Paul.